Hi everyone. Well, today I decided to do a deep dive into the ABS death data that is being released, well, relatively recently. Now the thing is, we often expect that when we go to the ABS, that when they make these conclusions, that people expect that that is to be the absolute truth. And I'm actually quite shocked myself that when I'm actually looking at the data, that it actually doesn't match up with the conclusions. Let me give you one example. So, one thing that the ABS likes to write about it says Australia recorded significantly lower than expected mortality during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, with death rates reaching historical lows. Now, you would think that that would be supported by the raw data. Well, interestingly enough, on every metric, it's not. In fact, in 2015, 16, I think 2018, 3 years of this data set, um, it's actually greater than those years. The death for 2020 is greater than those years. So even within a set of data, it's not significantly lower. And in order for something to be significantly lower, it would have to be more than at least two standard deviations away from the average. And in this case, it's not. But what is very interesting is that when you do calculate using the years from 2015 to 2020, and you average those years out and you calculate the standard deviation, that is the amount of variation that you expect away from the average, you actually do find that the year 2021 is a year where the actual rate of death is actually significantly higher, which is interesting because the ABS doesn't actually say that. Um, so what they're doing is they're publishing the data, and then they come out with these conclusions. And why would they do this? And the reason why is because nobody reads the data. People actually don't go into the numbers. What people do is they just go along and they cut and copy, and then they repeat, and then the news, press release go and they cut and copy, and everyone, after a while, it's like little repeater cells, will keep saying, oh yeah, you know what, 2020 was a terrible year. It wasn't a terrible year. 2020 was a great year because, we all locked down and we followed all the health advice, and as a result of all of that, we had statistically lower deaths. Well, actually, no, we did not have statistically lower deaths at all. And that, is a bit of a shock, isn't it, when you hear it, because you've heard it so often in the media. So anyway, don't take my word for it. Go to the ABS website, come to Uncensored Wisdom, and I've actually put links to it all there and all my workings. But I mean, it's pretty clear. I've done it from all different angles. There's no way you can actually say 2020 is a significantly lower year of deaths. So another thing, so what they actually say is in 2022, there were 111,008 deaths that occurred by the 31st of July, which were registered by the 30th of September, which is 16,375 more than the historical average, or roughly 17.3%. In July 2022, there were 17,936 deaths, which was roughly 16.2% above the historical average. Now, this is where it gets very interesting because these are actually outrageous numbers. And yet, there's no real red flags being raised, that even when the staggering birth data that was raised in question time in Parliament, there was no reply other than, oh yes, well, you know what, if the ABS saw something concerning, they would perhaps raise a red flag or something like that. But no, this actually hasn't happened. So in 2021, let me go back a step, I calculated that the actual increase in deaths was 6.58% over the baseline average. So that's a fairly significant number. But what was worse was that when I was calculating all of this, that I actually found that if you, for the last months of July and June, there was roughly about 4,015 deaths per week for those last 8 weeks. So we had the trend line was actually going up towards the end of the reporting period. So what you would normally do as a statistician is you would say, well, how will we project what will happen towards the end of the year? So let's just say it remains stable from June to and July, and we project all the way out to the end of 2022. Then we get a total number of deaths that we expect for 2022. We divide it by the average rate or average baseline average of deaths and multiply it by 100 to determine what the excess death or might be according to the baseline average. Now, what I actually found was that if you did it that way, calculating it, what we're looking at is a 24.4% rise in deaths. I mean, that's really pretty hysterically bad. And yet, here we are, and it's crickets. Now, I'm sort of wondering where is the point at which alarm bells might ring? I mean, are we going to wait till there's 50% of excess deaths over the baseline average? 100%? What number are we looking at? 30%? Because there actually has to be a number. You'd think there would be a trigger point. And usually the trigger point would be when it was outside 3 standard deviations from the norm. And we have well and truly exceeded that, and we exceeded that in 2021. And yet there is nothing being said about this. So anyway, what else was I going to say? Yes, and as for things like, I've discussed it in my article a bit more about how they categorised COVID-19 deaths, but I won't talk about here. And yeah, so, okay, what it really, I think sometimes when we talk about percentages, it's all numbers here, numbers there, and it's not really, quantifiable. We don't actually think of these numbers as people. But when you break it down, well, that number, what does that number actually equate to? That number actually equates to 757 excess deaths of people each and every week. And that was actually rising up from 204 excess deaths a week in 2021. So that's a lot of people. We're talking about 80 people a day. I mean, startling numbers. I think I'm just going to end it there. Have a look at my uncensoredwisdom.com for the article, and it's called Alarming ABS Deaths Data Analysis, because it sort of explains it more there. I just wanted to get it out there for you to understand that you just can't read something without actually going to the raw data, because a lot of things can be fudged. You can use averages, you can take data out, you can use a estimated population to calculate rates that are actually misleading, so it acts as though nothing's really happening. But one of the great things actually about Australia was we were closed up for the 3 years, so we actually are that perfect scientific model, because there was hardly any movement in or out of Australia, so the population remained stable. So when we're comparing the last 3 years, we actually expect the death data and the birth data to remain relatively stable, and this is not what we're seeing. So there's no other way of explaining it. Well, you'll have to draw your conclusions about the timeline of other things, but what I'm actually coming to say is that we should be alarmed by what is being reported in the data, and the fact that no one seems to be all that concerned. The media don't seem to be all that concerned. It's like we're living in some sort of twilight zone, and I'm just wondering at what point people will be concerned by this data. Okay, thanks.